What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video, and we wrapped up Pro Tour Aetherdrift and we have a whole video detailing the entire event from day 1, day 2, the top 8 of course, the metagame breakdown, and the win rates. And one of the things that surprised me the most from the event is the Domain deck absolutely dominating the format. Now, we all know that Domain has been around for quite a while. It even won a Pro Tour. I believe it was for Pro Tour All Will Be won. So it has a lot of competitive pedigree. I think that it's kind of, waxed and waned in popularity from time to time. Even a few months ago, I really wasn't that high on the deck. But coming into this event, I really thought it was going to be kind of a dark horse. I think that the Esper self-bounce deck and the other self-bounce decks were kind of the decks to beat going into the format. And of course, Gruul Aggro with the Mice package or even the Mono Red Aggro decks also offered a lot too, and theoretically have very good matchups against the Domain deck for the fact that they can just go and deal tons of damage really quickly out of the gate and just put them immediately on the back foot and force them to have very specific answers rather than playing their slow-ish game plan of just dominating you with really powerful spells that they get to cast for cheap and then drawing a bunch of cards with up the beanstalk. However, that's not how it played out, because as we'd see in our video, the win rates of these decks, Domain had like a 56% win rate as the third most registered deck, and the two other most registered decks in the format in Gruul Aggro and in the Esper Self-Bounce deck. Gruul Aggro had just over a 50% win rate, and then the Esper Self-Bounce deck had a below 50% win rate. So, I mean, the fact that Domain had like a 56% and, was up there with all the registered decks, and any deck that was even close to the Domain deck's win percentage didn't have nearly as many decks played. And for those of you that are kind of curious, like, well, why does that matter? Typically, when you have a lot of decks registered for a certain event, you want to see that win rate closer to 50%, because it usually means that, like, okay, like, there's some players obviously ran really well. There are also some players that didn't run very well. So it's kind of like a balancing mechanism where, if you have two people play a deck and they both do very well, then it's going to look like, oh, they have an 80%. Like, this looks like a great deck, but you also have to realize there's two people. Really, the more people you have playing a deck and the higher the win rate is, the better that it suggests the deck actually is. So the fact that, again, Domain had a 56% win rate for the entirety of the weekend, and of course, put multiple players in the top 8, and even had 3 of the 4 players in the top 4 and a mirror match in the finals, showed that Domain was an absolute, probably one of the best deck choices you could have made on the weekend. So really what I want to do with this video, and enough kind of pre-rambling, I want to talk about why Domain dominated Pro Tour Aetherdrift. I think that this is going to be, give us kind of a good idea of how the slower of the mid-range decks of the format dethroned easily probably the favorite, the odds-on favorite going into the Pro Tour, and how it easily dismantled some of the aggro decks also in the same vein, where, again, those aggro decks should have been able to kind of run over Gruul, kind of a rock, paper, scissors style, because, the Esper Self-Balance decks have a really good matchup against the typical aggro decks. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Of course, before we get into any of that stuff, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where we do breakdowns such as this, we go over some of the major events in competitive Magic, as well as exploring both the standard and modern format. So if that interests you, please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so you know future videos get posted. And if you learn anything today or you just enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like and leaving a comment down below how you feel about this Domain deck. Do you think it's a for sure best deck in the format now? Do you think it was just kind of a flash in the pan given the event? Whatever your thoughts are, I would love to hear them down in the comments below. And then finally, if you want to, go down in the description down below, you'll be able to find some of the deck lists that we're going to be referencing today in this video, along with some other links to, like, my Twitch channel if you want to go follow over there when we go live on Twitch, kind of streaming a lot of the standard, modern, and in sealed formats, as well as the Casual Spikes podcast YouTube channel, where we also go in pretty deep on the metagame, play some matches with some of the most popular decks in the metagame, and of course, break down some of the major events going on in Magic there as well. So if you want to go ahead and check that out, go ahead and subscribe over there. And lastly, I have my code down there for Manatraders, which is a monthly subscription service to where you can use on Magic Online to go and rank cards and play various different decks across various different formats. If you use my code in the description down below, you'll get 5% off your monthly subscription. I want to thank Manatraders for sponsoring the video. I want to thank you all for tuning into the video, and let's go ahead and break down why Domain dominated Pro Tour Aetherdrift. So in trying to figure out exactly how Domain was able to have a stranglehold on this standard metagame, we have to look at the two other most popular decks going into the event, and that was the Esper Pixie deck being the first one. I thought that this deck was kind of a slam dunk for sure, going to be the most registered deck in the format. It was not. It was very close though. But between this and like Gruul Aggro, they were like a few decks off from basically sharing kind of that top spot. So Esper Pixie, this was a deck that just a few months ago, probably like middle of December, towards the end of December, was kind of rising in popularity. People weren't sure if this was actually a real deck. It was doing well in challenges. It was doing very well on like Arena and in leagues, but it hasn't been kind of tested in one of the big standard events, where we have this 2-day competition, or in the case of the Spotlight Series, and having like a 2-day competition, to actually kind of put it through the gauntlet. How is it going to hold up in a super long tournament? And technically, it didn't get the result it wanted. I believe that there was no Esper Pixie in the top 8 of Spotlight Atlanta that we had at the beginning of January, but we did have a lot of other self-bounce decks kind of reach the top. Scott McNamara, which was a notable competitor at that Spotlight Series, because he ended up actually making the finals of that event, coming up just short against Gruul Aggro, but also doing very well at the Pro Tour with the same deck. But people kind of gravitate towards this Esper Pixie deck because it has a lot of other things going on. It has a particularly aggressive slant to it as well, that you can close out games very quickly rather than playing this kind of mid-rangey, like super grindy, and it can also be super grindy as well. So really the main things to know about this Esper Pixie deck is the fact of like how cheap this deck actually is. In this list in particular, Nicole Dublin's list from the event, like Overlord of the Balemerc is kind of, I think kind of a weird card. I haven't really seen any other versions of the deck playing Overlord. I've seen some versions that are playing Kaito, and Destroy Evil seems a little techie in there as well. But this is kind of like what we're looking at ideally is, thanks to Nurturing Pixies and Fear of Isolations, we get to pick up these really cheap and efficient enchantments. Things like Hopeless Nightmare could force our opponent to discard a card. They're going to lose 2 life. Storm Chaser's Talent is going to make a 1/1 with Prowess. So when we're kind of bouncing all of our things and replaying them over and over and over again, we're going to be making more and more otters. They're going to get bigger and bigger, and they're going to be able to get aggressive with our opponent, as well as things like Momentum Breaker being kind of this like sacrifice outlet. They were playing Tithing Blade in the spot. Well, now they have an enchantment that is going to sacrifice or may force them to sacrifice a creature or a vehicle of their choice. And then if they can't, they discard a card, so it's not completely dead if they don't have to sacrifice something. And it technically gets your engines going, meaning that later you can sacrifice an enchantment and gain life equal to your speed, which kind of help in some racing situations. And of course, Nowhere to Run being the removal spell of choice, where you're going to be able to give something -3/-3 until end of turn of your opponent's controls, and you'll be able to ignore like ward and hexproof abilities. So this is really sweet. These are the kind of the cards you're hoping to balance with cards like Nurturing Pixie and Fear of Isolation. These allow you to be aggressive while also, again, getting more and more value from these enchantments. And to top it all off, you can play something like Optimistic Scavenger, which is going to, put +1/+1 counters on your creatures. And this is where you kind of get that aggressive slant, where you play like a Hopeless Nightmare on turn 1, your opponent loses 2 life, discards a card. You end up playing like an Optimistic Scavenger, or even in this case, playing an Optimistic Scavenger on turn 1, playing a Hopeless Nightmare, putting a counter on Optimistic Scavenger, and then playing a Nurturing Pixie to bounce the Hopeless Nightmare. You now have a 2/2 in play that you're attacking with, another 2/2 flyer in play, and then you have a Hopeless Nightmare in your hand. So then when you get to turn 3, you play your third land, you can say, play a Hopeless Nightmare, play another Nurturing Pixie, pick up your Hopeless Nightmare, play your Hopeless Nightmare again, get another card out of your opponent's hand, put 2 +1/+1 counters on the board, and put another 2/2 flyer into play. And this kind of just snowballs and gets out of hand. Without going into like the finer details of this is essentially how this deck wants to operate. It wants to basically press its advantage. It wants to pressure you a lot with cheap creatures, as well as a lot of the cheap enchantments like Hopeless Nightmare. Just the fact that, in that scenario, I think we replayed it like 3 or 4 times, which means like our opponent lost 8 life and discarded 4 cards, which is insanely hard to keep up with. Maybe over the course of a game that goes 15-20 turns, like them discarding 4 cards and losing 8 life, that's just bound to happen anyway. The fact that this could happen on like turn 3 of the game is absolutely insane, and is really hard for a lot of decks to come back from, unless you're doing like the like Obstinate Baloth or the Wiltleaf Liege kind of stuff, where like, okay, your opponent's forcing you to discard a card. Okay, so I'm putting a 4/4 in play and I'm gaining 4 life, or I'm putting a 4/4 in play and it's going to be a Lord for all my green and white creatures, that sort of thing. So this is kind of where the Esper deck kind of thrives, is because in those situations you have like these cheap ways of bouncing your things. Of course, This Time Big Enough is probably one of the best cards in the format right now. The fact that you get to a point in the game and your opponent's in trouble when this town ain't big enough is bouncing 2 of your own permanents when you play it versus bouncing like one of your things and bouncing the other one. And of course with Storm Chaser's talent, kind of like the known combo is that you can level this up to level 2, return instant sorcery, this town ain't big enough, you bounce the Storm Chaser's talent, maybe one of your opponent's things or one of your own things, and then you can just kind of go through this loop. It is mana intensive, but this is pretty powerful when you get to, essentially tempo your opponent out, also make another 1/1, also just eventually flood the board with all these creatures so that when you're doing this loop and you're hitting your land drops, you're going to end up being able to, pick it up, replay it, pick up this town ain't big enough, and then continue to kind of loop over and over again to make a bunch of creatures, of course, get a bunch of prowess triggers, and eventually just overwhelm your opponent with a giant board full of otters. And this is where we have to start with Domain, because this deck, even though it does have an aggressive slant, it also is super grindy, again, with all the cards that want to kind of pick up your enchantments, replay them, and, kind of flood the board and put a bunch of counters on things. Like, this deck can go pretty wide, it can go pretty tall, thanks to Optimistic Scavenger, and even Mockingbird here as well, being able to copy, something like Optimistic Scavenger, other Nurturing Pixies, or Fear of Isolations. I guess Fear of Isolation not being nearly as good, but like Nurturing Pixie, Optimistic Scavenger, you can play this card for 1 mana, copy one of them, and then get one of their abilities, either to put counters on things when you have enchantments enter play or unlock rooms, and then Nurturing Pixie, of course, to pick up those things and replay them. Also getting to copy your own opponent's creatures is really sweet. But nonetheless, like, this is kind of the idea, right? You're a deck that can get pretty aggressive when you need to be, but you also aren't necessarily aggressive. You don't have to be, because of the fact that you're going to be able to grind by making your opponent discard cards, flooding the board with 1/1s, replaying all your things, putting a bunch of flyers into play, putting +1/+1 counters on your creatures. This does grind pretty well. And that's a game that the Domain decks want to play. We're typical of seeing these lines of play where we play like a turn 2 up the Beanstalk, and we play Overlord of the Hauntwoods for its impending cost, which then triggers the beans, crazy enough, so you're not spending that mana to actually trigger the beans. You're spending it, you're still getting the value that you want from it. You're making your 4th land drop, which means that you can go into your 5th land, play a sweeper, and make a lot of these creature decks very sad. But this is kind of the idea, where as kind of players are building their Domain decks and they have these kind of cheap interactive spells to where they can kind of last an extra few turns, to where, okay, like, we can get to a position where if the Esper Pixie deck wants to play this like slow grindy game, well, then we're going to slowly grind them out by getting to draw a bunch of extra cards, so them discarding cards really isn't going to matter. And of course we have other ways of catching up as well, which we'll be getting into with the Domain deck. But that's kind of the thing to keep in mind here with this Esper Pixie deck, is that it is a mid-range deck that has a fast option rather than being an aggressive deck that can grind. And it's all going to be dependent on its draws. It's kind of like the nature of mid-range decks. This doesn't obviously really want to play a control game plan. It can, thanks to its removal spells like Nowhere to Run and Grimbauble, and being able to pick those up and just kind of manage the board that way and get some tempo over your opponent. But again, that is the thing to keep in mind here is with Esper Pixie, is that, again, mid-range deck that can play pretty aggressively and can play also kind of a long game as well here. So, that's Esper Pixie. Let's go ahead and take a look at Gruul Aggro and kind of understand how they fit into the puzzle here, because, what Esper Pixie here is trying to do is actually influence a lot of what the Gruul Aggro decks have decided to do. So here we have Gruul Mice. This is essentially the aggro deck of choice for a lot of players. And as we can see here, we have the typical mouse package of Emberheart Challenger, Manifold Mouse, and Heartfire Hero. This is a way that you can just deal tons and tons of damage. Manifold Mouse is going to give your creatures double strike, and thanks to Monstrous Rage being probably one of the best red cards in the format, you're going to be able to give it your thing trample and permanently give it trample with the Monster Roll token and just deal insane amounts of damage early on. So again, this is a deck that is definitely more aggressive, but with the Pixie deck being able to interact pretty early on, and of course rebuy all of their kind of removal spells, the Gruul Aggro decks have shifted a little bit more towards playing a kind of mid-rangey strategy. That's why we see 4 Screaming Nemesis in this list. I believe at least some of the other ones they play like 2 or 3. This one is just going for the full 4. It allows you to be pretty aggressive while also against some other decks just being able to be like, boom, here's like my 3/3 that you can never attack into, because even if you're able to kill it in combat, you're going to end up taking a bunch of damage, not being able to gain any life, which is pretty important for the Domain matchups because they have a way to gain an insane amount of life pretty early on in the game. So we see that, and then we see like Overprotect over something like the Snakeskin Veil, because the Nowhere to Runs end up ignoring the hexproof and the ward abilities on things. So overprotect, giving something +3/+3, trample, hexproof, and indestructible. This is like a way that you can kind of blow your opponent out if they try to know where to run your thing. While again, you're going to essentially just like negate the -3/-3, but your thing's going to get trample and indestructible. So it ends up kind of accomplishing its thing anyway, because it's more than likely going to kill the creature that's blocking it and trample over for some damage. And then we see 4 Innkeeper's Talent, which is not something that is normally played in this deck. So like Innkeeper's Talent definitely gives you some options here where you're going to be able to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, meaning that when you target one of your things that have Valiant, you're going to be able to trigger those things. For Emberheart Challenger, you're going to see an extra card. Heartfire Hero, you're going to put a +1/+1 counter on it. You can pay a green. Permanents you control, you have Ward 1 on them, which is super annoying. Especially against the nowhere to run decks, and even like if they don't have a nowhere to run in play, then it can be very hard for them to interact profitably with your creatures with +1/+1 counters on them. And of course, if you ever get to level 3, you're going to be able to put twice that many counters on a permanent or player whenever they get a permanent of that kind. So like Innkeeper's Talent is going to put 2 +1/+1 counters. Heartfire Hero's triggers are going to put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Paw Patch Recruit, another card that kind of makes this deck slant towards maybe a mid-rangey type of strategy, is the fact that if a creature you control becomes a target or spell of ability an opponent controls, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control other than the creature that was targeted. So getting to offspring this, you get 2 of these in play, your opponent goes to kill one of them. Guess what? You're going to be able to distribute +1/+1 counters onto 2 creatures, which again kind of go in with Innkeeper's Talent last ability. If you kind of get to live that dream, chances are your opponent's not going to be living very long. So we talked about, again, this Gruul aggro deck theoretically should have a good matchup against the Domain decks. Again, Domain kind of wants to play a little bit slower. They want to play their Beans on turn 2. They want to impend an Overlord of the Hauntwoods on turn 3, draw a card, get another land into play, and then from there just kind of impend Overlords, maybe even play more up the beanstalks, impend more Overlords, get more triggers, and just be able to play this game where, okay, every time I play a spell or every time I do essentially a game action other than playing a land, I'm going to end up drawing multiple cards and just bearing you in card advantage, being able to find whatever I need. If you're going to flood the board, I'm going to find a Wrath. If you're going to try to load up on one thing, I'm going to find my targeted removal and just absolutely blow you out for going too deep into this one specific creature. And unfortunately for Gruul Mice, this is still a deck that doesn't necessarily play well into Wraths. And of course, Sunfall is still legal in the format. So it's a 5-mana Wrath that they play 4 copies of in Domain that is going to get rid of Heartfire Hero, and you're not going to get the trigger, which a lot of the time is able to kind of help you close out games as this Gruul aggro deck, because it ends up being a creature where your opponent has to block it. And if they end up just using like something like Go for the Throat or Cut Down, really is kind of losing some popularity, I believe, because a lot of the mid-range decks are also losing a lot of popularity. But, you have these ways of just blowing up your own Heartfire Hero or just finding a way to, again, get in tons of damage with this thing and being an absolute nuisance when your opponent is not able to kill it early on here. So that is kind of where these aggro deck, the Gruul aggro deck, can just have its draws where it goes Heartfire Hero on turn 1, Manifold Mouse on turn 2, give it double strike, attack. All right, next turn, target again with Manifold Mouse, and then go Monstrous Rage, Overprotect, and absolutely just one-shot your opponent. No big deal, wham bam, thank you ma'am, good night, game is over. But now that this deck has a lot of the more mid-range elements, there's a lot of hands that you can come up with where maybe you have a Hired Claw and an Innkeeper's Talent and 2 or 3 lands, maybe a Monstrous Rage and stuff like that. And now you're kind of okay, well, I can load up on this one Hired Claw. Oh, my opponent played a Leyline Binding. Now I can't really do anything. Or I'm going to go wide. I'm not really putting out a ton of power with Manifold Mouse. It's really just putting +1/+1 counters on with Innkeeper's Talent. Oh, my opponent played a Wrath. Now I'm kind of on the back foot and I'm left kind of trying to rebuild from that point. Now you can play around Wraths and stuff like that, but when you're getting into this mid-range game plan, and kind of the overarching point of this is that the top decks of the format are kind of committing towards this more mid-range game plan where we're going to kind of dig in and play a lot longer of a game. Domain absolutely dominates in those because typically in mid-range mirrors, whoever has the bigger spells are going to win the game. And unfortunately with Beans, and it's going to be the second point that we kind of get to, is that a lot of its expensive cards that then also allow it to draw cards thanks to Up the Beanstalk is they don't actually cost that much mana, and we're going to get to here in a second, but that's something to keep in mind. Again, the overarching point for this is that both of these decks play a mid-range strategy, and there's a lot of draws that lead them to kind of playing this kind of mid-range style, especially after you kind of blow up plan A. that it makes it very hard for them to compete then with Domain, because Domain is able to play a little bit more aggressively slanted to where they are able to kind of interact pretty profitably with some of the stuff that they have going on in these two styles of deck. So we're going to take a look at the Domain deck and kind of explain point number 2 of why this deck was able to kind of dominate the Pro Tour. So now we've kind of arrived to the main event. Obviously, the deck we've been talking about, almost like a boogeyman of sorts in the Domain Overlords deck. Now, to kind of recap what we just talked about, the format has a very aggressive slant to it. There are obviously some plays that we have outlined from both the Gruul aggro deck and the Esper Pixie / Self-Bounce deck, where you can play a pretty aggressive game plan and get in a ton of damage early. And that's kind of like your recipe for success for beating these Domain Overlord decks. The problem is that they are also built in a way to play kind of this longer game, which kind of goes into Domain Overlord's game plan. And kind of a lesson for everybody when we talk about playing like mid-range mirrors and things like that. A lot of the time when you're playing like mid-range decks or control decks and you're playing in these mirror matches, typically the players that have like the bigger spells end up winning the game. And with kind of what Domain Overlords has going on here, it's kind of playing into the same reason why Up the Beanstalk ended up getting banned in Modern, and just obviously getting to flex its power and how it ends up getting to kind of interact with the format. Getting to do it a little bit differently, because Modern, you abuse like free spells that would, cost you like exiling a card from your hand, but you're going to make that card back. And with the more Beanstalks you had in your hand, you could actually start netting cards on top of getting some very powerful enter the battlefield effects. So, that's where we're going to start with this Domain deck, is the fact that it gets to play probably the best card in Standard, Up the Beanstalk. 2 mana, enters the battlefield, draw a card, or whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, draw a card. The problem with Up the Beanstalk is that it does not care how you cast the 5 mana spell. It doesn't care that you spent 5 mana to cast the spell. It just cares that when you put something on the stack, that its original mana value cost 5 or more. And this works out very well with probably some of the best creatures that we currently have in Standard in the Overlords, specifically Overlord of the Hauntwoods, Overlord of the Mistmoors. There's, of course, Overlord of the Boiler Bilges, which is like the red Overlord. Then there's the blue Overlord, like I think the Overlord of the Flood Pits is also a 5-mana Overlord. And Overlord of the Baelmark. They're all 5 or greater. Overlord of the Mistmoors, Overlord of the Hauntwoods are probably the best ones specifically for the Domain deck, and might just be the best ones overall. But, these cards obviously cost 7 mana. Overlord of the Hauntwoods costs 5 mana. But they have this thing called Impending, and they both have Impending 4. So you pay this little cost. So for Overlord of the Hauntwoods, it's 2 green and 1. For Overlord of the Mistmoors, it's 2 generic and 2 white. And you can cast them as just regular enchantments. They're going to enter the battlefield with 4 impending counters on them, and then they're going to give you their enter the battlefield ability. In this case, Overlord of the Mistmoors, you're going to make a few 2/1 flyers. Overlord of the Hauntwoods, you're going to make a colorless land token that is called Everywhere. That is every basic land type, which is going to be important later. But the fact that you cast these for impending cost, doesn't mean that the card's mana value is now 3 or 4. It still maintains its mana value of 5, and in Overlord of the Mistmoors case, 7, which means that if you cast any of these for their impending cost, Up the Beanstalk is going to allow you to draw a card from that. And this is where we kind of talk about like the Domain deck kind of getting to snowball and being this mid-range deck that if players are wanting to play a longer game than, playing for, the first like 4 or 5 turns of the game, we'll say, this deck will absolutely win 90% of the time. And it's going to be really on the back of Up the Beanstalk, because I think that's kind of where it pushes that, 90% chance to win to like a 99, almost 100% chance to win, because you have to draw specifically like very bad when you have one or multiple Beanstalks going and you're playing this kind of strategy. Ideally for Domain, if you play Beanstalk on 1 and you get to impend an Overlord of the Hauntwoods on 2, or on 3, then you get to draw a card. You get to essentially get an extra land into play that is going to satisfy the conditions of Leyline Binding to make it cost 1 mana, which also triggers Up the Beanstalk, another expensive card that doesn't actually cost that much mana, but it just has that high mana value, so that's all that matters. It allows you to then, when you hit your 5th land drop, and you're able to play some other cheaper spells, like even playing Ride's End, which is kind of a new technology for the deck. A 5-mana spell that is going to exile a target creature or vehicle, but it will cost 3 less if it targets a tapped permanent, meaning that it can cost 2 mana, and again, does not matter that you spent 2 mana for it, you're still going to draw a card with Up the Beanstalk if you cast this Ride's End, regardless if you spend the full mana for it. This is where, again, I think the deck thrives, because this is kind of like the double-edged sword of like, okay, well, now that we're in this kind of early-ish to like, we're getting to the middle part of the game here, even if you're not doing the, say, like Up the Beanstalk and the Overlord thing, you still have like these very cheap interactive spells like Ride's End. Your opponent's going to want to attack with like a Heartfire hero. You don't necessarily want to get lost their Heartfire hero because they're going to have a ton of counters on it. They're going to probably pump it up with like a Monstrous Rage. Ride's End is perfect because you're just going to exile that creature and they're not going to get to blow up their rat or their mouse and absolutely deal a ton of damage to you and continue to put that pressure on. So Ride's End being a very nice answer for those decks. And then also the fact that, Get Lost is a very good like catch-all removal spell for like the mirror matches and, from what other players have going on, because it's just another cheap removal spell that you're going to be able to play on some early creatures, and giving your opponent map tokens doesn't really matter. Like the card advantage that they're necessarily going to get from playing the map tokens or, from cracking the map tokens is not going to equal anything close to what you're doing with Up the Beanstalk. So that's kind of step number 1. Up the Beanstalk is the best deck, or is probably the best card in Standard when you pair it with all of these cards that are expensive, that also aren't really that expensive. Like they cost a lot of mana, but they don't actually cost you a lot of mana. Again, very reminiscent of what we had seen in Modern. Going even further, the fact that you get to play very efficient removal that also plays with Up the Beanstalk, and we just talked about Ride's End essentially being a 2-mana spell, Get Lost being a 2-mana spell, Day of Judgment being a 4-mana Wrath, which is pretty cheap, playing Sunfall, also probably one of the best Wrath spells you can play because it exiles all creatures, again, getting around any death triggers, and you get a creature back as well by creating a Phyrexian Incubate token. Then you can flip it, and it's going to be hopefully massive in a way that you can kind of close out the game. And again, with like these cheap removal spells, you're able to kind of beat some of the more aggressive draws, which also leads me to the fact that the domain decks are also able to really kind of play pretty risky with their life total thanks to this card Zur. Not only do we get to draw cards from our impended Overlords, when we have a Beanstalk in play, also the fact that they're enchantments means that they're not going to be very easily interacted with. We even see from a lot of these other cards, like Get Lost is like a way that you can interact with Overlords just as enchantments, but your typical removal spells aren't going to work. Zur is going to then use its ability to turn those enchantments into creatures, so we end up getting a 5/5 Overlord of the Hauntwoods, we end up getting a 7/7 Overlord of the Mistmoors if we have them impended, and those enchantments are going to have Death Touch, Lifelink, Hexproof, meaning that your opponent has to deal with Zur, and then they're able to deal with the Overlords, but, they don't necessarily want to do that, or, they have to do it, and it messes up, really messes up a lot of things. Because while it would be pretty annoying to have to play a 3-mana thing and then also play your 3 or 4-mana thing again, paying a bunch of mana, maybe in a game where you're not necessarily playing Overlord of the Hauntwoods, or maybe aren't able to get anything really going, maybe you're missing lands, it'd be really annoying. But Zur makes it even more annoying because you're going to have to, play your removal spells on this, which means that you don't necessarily have your Go for the Throats and things like that for Zur. Also, the fact that it has 4 toughness is pretty big when you think of cards like Grimbauble, where you're going to have to play Grimbauble twice or play Nowhere to Run twice to be able to deal with a Zur Eternal Schemer, and that's a lot of resources and game actions dedicated to one card, where it's still probably animating a Overlord of the Hauntwoods, Overlord of the Mistmoors, the turn it comes down, or even depending on how late it comes down, ends up targeting 2 or 3 things. There's plenty of times in games where we had seen the typical, Beans on 2, Overlord of the Hauntwoods on 3, Zur plus Animate on 4, make another Everywhere token, and then now we're kind of off to the races here because now we have 7 lands in play. All of our spells don't actually cost 7 mana, so we're able to play multiple, high-costed cards, continue to draw more cards, keep the gas going, and have more food for Zur Eternal Schemer to just kind of go out there and blow things up. Even now even playing Zur on 4, getting to, play an Overlord of the Mistmoors, playing another land and then leaving up Leyline Binding. So then now when you play your 7th land, you have Zur coming down and you're able to animate an Overlord of the Mistwoods, Overlord of the Mistmoor, and Overlord of the Hauntwood, and you're able to get in there and smack your opponent for a ton of damage that way. It's just, there's a lot going on here where this deck has its own aggressive slant, and it's bigger than what the other aggressive decks are doing. Obviously, if you stumble at any point and this deck gets to have its aggressive start, it's going to close the game super quickly by just gaining a ton of life and then also taking chunks out of your life total while also just drowning you in straight card advantage. So I think that's kind of like the main reasons why Domain Overlords is played very well, and we'll kind of wrap up everything very nicely here on the end card. But that's kind of the things that we need to keep in mind in this 3-deck format currently, is that if you are Gruul aggro, if you try to play more mid-rangey, you are going to have a better matchup against Esper. That's kind of where players have kind of gravitated towards, is being the Esper Pixie deck, but you're going to be worse in general against the Domain Overlords deck the more cards that you play to kind of play a mid-range strategy. Same thing with the Esper Pixie deck. It does have the aggressive slants. Maybe it needs to focus on playing more aggressively so that a lot of these decks that are just trying to play a longer game, it can say, nah, I'm going to just put counters on a bunch of flyers. I'm going to be able to kind of press my advantage with my very powerful 1 mana and 2 mana cards, and then I'm going to just completely run you over. While Domain is trying to, kind of do the same thing, and you can kind of try to interact profitably as the, Esper Pixie deck, but really with the current state of the standard format where, these two decks at the top want to play more mid-rangey, Domain is absolutely going to eat them alive every single time. So we'll kind of wrap everything up here in the end and hopefully do a good job of doing that. So to kind of hammer the points home here, with the format being more mid-rangey and kind of bending toward the whim of Esper Pixie, which is probably the more consistent of the, 3 decks of the format, I would say, where you're not going to necessarily get punked out by the aggro decks because you do have some very good options of interacting early on. So this is a Domain deck. Honestly, I would probably rather be in the Domain seat than something like Esper Pixie or Gruul Mice, but the sentiment is kind of there. I think the fact that Esper Pixie was kind of the dominant, like kind of mid-range deck that people were playing, and they kind of figured out with Gruul, with the Domain decks, you have ways of kind of out card advantaging your Esper Pixie opponent, meaning that you're going to have kind of more cards to kind of choose and pick from and be able to interact very favorably with those problematic permanents, and even get rid of some of those permanents your opponent is going to want to bounce and replay over and over again. Aside from things like this town ain't big enough, there's no really instant speed ways of doing it, so you can kind of punish them for playing out their thing and either not picking it back up with one of their pixies or leaving up enough mana to cast this town ain't big enough. On top of that too, with the aggro decks wanting to play more mid-rangey, and again the format as a whole wanting to lean towards being mid-range here, the fact that the Domain Overlords deck is just playing the bigger spells, wants to be playing this long game, it's going to out card advantage you, its card quality is going to be a lot better overall, its removal is going to be super efficient, heck, even its threats are super efficient when it gets to play a card like Zur Eternal Schemer to kind of animate those cards, turn them into creatures when they need them to be. They're going to have hexproof, so you're not going to be able to interact with them until you kill the Zur, and it turns out the 2 best decks in the format of interacting, or rather not even interacting, but the 2 other most played decks in the format, you're going to have to do a lot of work with the Esper Pixie deck to be able to kill a Zur, because again, you're going to have to, play your 2 mana to play your Nowhere to Run, and then you're going to have to pick it back up with This Town Ain't Big Enough, and then replay it, something like that, or even like Nurturing Pixie, that's still 5 mana to essentially kill a Zur and have a 2/2 in play, which isn't nearly as good when a lot of the time you're doing it with like Hopeless Nightmare and you're getting your opponent to discard multiple cards, putting a 2/2 in play and applying pressure to them. While, again, your opponent is still going to need to attack you for a bunch of damage and create more 2/1 flyers and potentially more land tokens. So then it gets to a point in the game where it's like, okay, well, now I'm impending multiple Overlords, I'm drawing multiple cards, and I'm also able to leave up interaction for a lot of your impermanents. I don't know why that was such a hard thing to kind of get through, but, the brain is struggling here, but we're almost to the end here. That's kind of like my assumption of this Domain deck. I think the fact that if the format continues to want to be slow and be grindy, which I believe for Esper Pixie, maybe it starts to take a more aggressive slant. Maybe there's like another set of enchantments out there that will allow it to either play maybe less of a mid-rangey / longer game plan, and maybe just completely full send into being aggressive. Maybe we see more Mockingbird so that you can play essentially more copies of Pixie and more copies of the whatever, the enchantment lady that puts plus one counters on your things, because I can't remember that card's name for the life of me unless I'm actually just reading it. That's at least a way that these decks could, in theory, start loading up on counters, when they go and do their loop and they put, 6 extra power into play, and then they make like 1 or 2 otters or whatever the case may be, that this would maybe be enough to be able to beat the Domain Overlords deck. But again, with all the efficient removal, all the efficient mass removal that is in the format, and you're not really punishing the Domain decks if you kind of hold back at all, unless they just only end up drawing 1 Wrath or whatever. I think the big thing is just trying to take them off their game, and nobody could really do that effectively at the Pro Tour. Again, why the Domain deck posted a 56% win rate, and the other 2 decks in the format, combined essentially had a sub 50% win rate, which is a pretty rough look. But, going into it, I don't expect players to stop playing Gruul. I don't expect players to stop playing Esper Pixie. We might just see Esper Pixie kind of take more of an aggressive slant, and then people just say, okay, I either want to be Esper Pixie or I want to be Domain, and they're going to end up being hyper aggressive, which we see from like the leyline builds of aggro, or they're going to kind of stick with this Gruul Mice, and then again playing like Innkeeper's Talent, things like that, to just have a little bit more staying power against some of those mid-range decks, and just hope that when they play against Domain, they kind of keep their aggressive hands of like Heartfire Hero, Manifold Mouse into like Monstrous Rage Overprotect with Double Strike to like absolutely blow people out. But that's kind of my my thoughts, theories, opinions of like why Domain Overlords absolutely dominated Pro Tour Aetherdrift. If you have any different opinions or anything like that, please let me know in the comments down below. I think those are kind of like the main points. We could probably go into some other like sub details, but again, I think with the format wanting to be slower, that at that point incentivizing players to play a lot bigger, and Domain just getting to play probably one of the best spells in Standard, getting to negate a lot of the the other best spell in the format. This town ain't big enough, because again, if you bounce your opponent's Impended Overlord, kind of who cares, because then I'm just going to get to draw another card. I'm going to make another land token. So unless you're just going to be winning the game with that move, it just doesn't seem to make any sense here. There's no sense to like Hopeless Nightmare, because them losing the life, who cares? They're just going to gain it all back in chunks anyway, while also again maintaining kind of the card advantage, because they're going to have to play out their things and then replace it with the cards they draw. So again, let me know in the comments down below what you think caused Domain Overlords. If there is something that maybe I missed, or maybe something I didn't articulate enough, please feel free to ask me in the comments down below. I really do appreciate all the interactions and stuff, because it allows me to kind of maybe further explain certain thoughts, and maybe even change my opinion on certain things. But yeah, that's gonna do it for this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Of course, comment down below what you think of the Domain Overlords deck. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, if you're entertained or if you learned something. And that's gonna do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.